Right, welcome everybody to this Festival of Social Sciences event, and thank you for coming to the audience, but also to the people who are presenting today. So in this event, we're going to hear from activists working in 5 countries across 3 continents and 3 time zones. And these people are going to share their knowledge and expertise on the criminalisation of people who help migrants. I'm Lucy Mayblin. I'm Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Sheffield. And over the past year, I've been building a database of cases around the world where people have been criminalised for helping migrants. And you can see that at crimesofsolidarity.org. So that's really collecting cases where people who've acted in solidarity or undertaken humanitarian work have been arrested, detained, potentially also imprisoned. And many of those people are, of course, migrants themselves as well. This work has led me to discussions with a number of the speakers here today, and I just wanted to give a bit of a general introduction to the issue and to the database before introducing our speakers. So let me give some example cases first, just to give you a flavour of what we're talking about. So in 2004, 2 humanitarian workers who had defected from North Korea and obtained South Korean citizenship were discovered rescuing other defectors in China and were imprisoned for 5 years. In 2009, a Sri Lankan man seeking asylum in Australia was arrested for smuggling. He was driving a boat to fellow refugees to safety. In 2012, a couple in Serbia were arrested and charged with smuggling for taking in a family of homeless people from Afghanistan. In 2016, 5 volunteer lifeguards were arrested for human smuggling in Greece after responding to an SOS call at sea. In 2017, a journalist and human rights defender was arrested in Morocco for colluding with traffickers after alerting the maritime authorities of Spain, Morocco, and Algeria to migrant distress calls. And in the same year, a farmer in France was arrested for harbouring illegal immigrants after offering food and lodging to people with nowhere to stay. In 2018, a university professor was arrested near the southern border of the US for harbouring undocumented migrants after offering 2 people shelter in a refuge centre and tending to their blisters. And these are just I gave a big list there, but it's just a small number of cases of examples internationally of the criminalisation of people who help other people on the move. The Crimes of Solidarity and Humanitarianism database, which I mentioned, I've been building that for about 10 months, and it currently contains 242 cases where people have been formally criminalised for helping others, and 47 separate laws allowing for the criminalisation of such actions. And even though this is absolutely a drop in the ocean, the database offers, I hope, and will continue kind of as it builds, to offer an unprecedented international view of the criminalisation of solidarity and humanitarianism with migrants. So people are arrested for helping others, doing all kinds of activities, some of which you would not imagine you could be arrested for. So people are arrested for helping others cross borders, but that might involve saving someone's life in the sea, in the desert, or in a mountain, providing people with food and water, even if that provision is indirect, so leaving water in the desert, for example, for people to happen upon, providing people with shelter in domestic homes or designated shelters, driving or steering a boat with people on board who have the intention of crossing a border and seeking asylum, even as an asylum seeker yourself, that happens, offering or providing people with washing facilities like showers, disrupting deportation flights, maybe in an organized way, but also in a completely spontaneous fashion, offering or providing legal or safe travel advice to people who intend to cross a border irregularly, providing medical support or driving someone to a medical facility for treatment, taking part in pro-migrant activist groups and particularly public demonstrations, taking photographs of people crossing a dangerous border with the intention of using it for journalistic or advocacy purposes, and entering spaces, towns, or territories where migrants can be found in need, but where unauthorized humanitarian work has been prohibited, and also helping people to leave a country and go elsewhere in order to seek refuge. There's no typical profile of an offender across this database, so people of all immigration and citizenship statuses, even the status of tourist, have been subject to these measures. a wide range of occupations, from business people to social workers, magazine editors, students, nuns, taxi drivers, people of all ages, from young to retired people. And the only pattern seems to be that those who are most heavily policed are unpaid volunteers or spontaneous helpers, rather than state-sanctioned humanitarian organisations. And while citizens of more secure status are heavily sanctioned, people who are migrants themselves are often detained and deported, even if they've been living in the country where they were arrested for decades. There's a wide geographical spread, of course, but bottlenecks where migrants find themselves stopped from moving on, particularly around border zones, tend to then necessitate humanitarian work. And those are also places where both migrants and humanitarians, which are obviously overlapping categories, are more heavily policed. So we can think of criminalisation narrowly in terms of laws and legal procedures, but also more expansively into other actions. So there are laws and legal action which is recorded and can be researched retrospectively in countries where those records are publicly available and can be kind of quantified, and then most of the cases in the database. But there's also phenomena like police harassment, threats of arrest, detention, interrogation, searches of property, etc., which come to nothing, and this kind of thing really needs kind of local qualitative research and reporting from people on the ground to explore, and is much more difficult to capture in something like the database. A really wide range of laws are deployed, though, to criminalise solidarity and humanitarian activities. So these include facilitating entry, so smuggling, facilitating stay, so harbouring, but also anti-terror, anti-organised crime, anti-protest, anti-NGO legislation, holding dangerous weapons, endangering maritime and airport security, driving an unsafe vessel, espionage, criminal association, and membership of a criminal network or gang. So in other words, we have sort of two ends of the spectrum, from laws designed to combat one-off health and safety infractions to very serious crimes like terrorism and international organized crime that are being applied to organizations and individuals who assist refugees and migrants. In international law, there's no legal basis for criminalizing humanitarian or solidaristic actions. Smuggled migrants shouldn't themselves be criminalized for smuggling, and refugees shouldn't be penalized on their journeys to safety. But in practice, at the regional and national levels, that's where you find the laws kind of in contradiction with international law to allow for the criminalization of this kind of help. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from our speakers in a minute. So why is this happening, we might ask? Well, in response to the movement of people who cross borders, state authorities have introduced a range of bordering techniques to control and criminalize irregular transit into and out of their territories, even where people are seeking asylum. So in the face of what academics call bordering, so more and more fences and more border controls and restrictions, migrants always continue to move out of necessity, but usually along more dangerous routes to account for those border controls. And so states continuously diversify and intensify bordering efforts, while those migrants whose movement is essentially illegalized continue to move using ever more risky and clandestine methods. And the criminalization of people who help migrants in desperate situations is an extension of this bordering. It extends border controls to groups who might not previously have been subject to them, such as citizens of the country in which they're arrested. And this often involves authoritarian measures which seek to crack down on civil society groups, to spread disinformation, to disable the voice of civil society and others. In some countries, this is part of a broader authoritarian shift in which civil society generally is being curtailed, maybe disinformation is rife and criticism of the state is routinely silenced. And in other states, they're primarily authoritarian in the migration space. So they use measures against migrants and migrant solidarity organizations that wouldn't necessarily be thinkable in other policy contexts, although sometimes in some other policy contexts, and it's interesting to think across which ones. So in a minute, we're going to hear from activists facing these actions in different locations. First, we're going to hear from Marta Pietrosinska, who's both a researcher at the University of Warsaw and an activist with the Border Group, who've been working at the Poland-Belarus border in an exclusion zone where humanitarians weren't permitted to help migrants for a period of time. Next, we'll hear from Imogen Dobby, who is involved with the Sea-Watch Legal Fund, who fundraised to support the legal cases of activists who were arrested for their search and rescue work in the Mediterranean, though an increasingly expansive number of different cases. Then we'll hear from Ro and Gina from No More Deaths in the US. This is a group working across the US-Mexico border to prevent deaths in the border zone, in part through humanitarian work. And then we're going to hear from Jose Luis Loera from Casa Refugiados, an organization who help migrants in Mexico. And hopefully, if he has arrived by that point, we will hear from Ethan Hee-Sok Shin from the Transnational Working Group in Seoul. I think it is 1 a.m. in Seoul right now, so we will be hugely grateful to Ethan if he's able to attend. And the Transnational Justice Working Group are a humanitarian organization who gather data and raise awareness on North Korean human rights abuses. And they're also highly knowledgeable on the situation of people who help North Koreans escape into and then out of China. After we've heard from these speakers, we'll open it up to a discussion about these diverse contexts, and you can add a question via the Slido platform, which is in the event link. I've not used Slido before, but I did manage to click on that link and access it, and it looks very simple. So if I can do it, I'm sure you certainly can also. So I will move over now to Marta, and we look forward to hearing from her for 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll go through the speakers, and then we'll assemble some questions. Okay.
Thank you, Lucy, for having me here and to create a platform for all of us to speak about our activism. And to start with, I have to say that I'm talking mainly in behalf of those people who are really like going into the forest and helping the migrants on Polish-Belarusian border, because me myself as an activist, I'm doing some other works, not direct in the forest, even though I know the zone somehow. So in Polish context, the situation is quite new because it happened, it started last summer, exactly in August 2021, when the road through the Belarus that was centrally coordinated by the Lukashenko authoritarian regime was open, and straight away people who wanted to apply for asylum started to be pushed back. No, they were not even allowed to apply for asylum. So and straight away, just after like few days, maybe 2 weeks, the state of emergency zone was applied and implemented around the Polish-Belarusian border. So like it's around 200 kilometers long border with primeval forest. This is important. So it's not so easy to go through this border and not to get lost. There are swamps, there are rivers. So it's extremely hard to go through the forest, and people were flying to Minsk were like cheated, and they said, oh, it's so easy to go to European Union. So they got trapped for many days, for many weeks in this primeval forest, being like ping pong, pushing back from one side to another side, because also in Belarusian uniformed service, they were not allowing them to return to Minsk, return to their home countries. They were trapped. And still they are, because the humanitarian crisis is ongoing. So the state of emergency zone was implemented there. That means that no humanitarian aid organization, no one who is not working or not living in the zone, or no media, no one was allowed to go into the stripe around like 3 kilometers out of the border. So mainly at the border work local people who were never before involved or vast majority of them never before involved in humanitarian aid or migrant solidarity. They were somehow forced to do it, because when you hear like someone is just calling for help and you can hear the voice because it's just a few hundred meters from your house, what you should do. So mainly local people became involuntary activists. Also, group like Border Group that I represent and some other NGOs start to work on the borders of the no-go zone, providing humanitarian and medical aid, because migrants are and were in the bad condition after swimming through the river or walking through the swamps, through the primeval forest they were totally unprepared for this journey. And now going to the topic of criminalisation. So in Poland, providing humanitarian aid to anybody is not even something you might or might not do, but you're obliged. If somebody is in need, you're obliged to help this person. And because of it, until now, there were some attempts to prosecute activists or local people. No one was prosecuted. So courts repeatedly were like refusing to prosecute people, but what happened in Poland is a huge discourse of criminalization. So me, myself, as an educator, just before the no-go zone was imposed, we were going from home to home at the border, knocking to people and trying to explain them that giving food or a glass of water, calling the ambulance, it's legal. So our campaign was to somehow diminish the discourse of criminalization. Activists in Poland who are working at the border, because now there is almost no-go zone. There's like 200 meters from the border that you cannot come to, but it's not the zone that was before. We're intimidated, we're like arrested. Their situation that soldiers with long gun were standing over the activists who are put it on the ground. The cars are searched, the houses are searched. Few persons were arrested and put for like 48 hours to the jail. And of course, afterwards they were released, because there is nothing in law that can make people to be prosecuted. But the biggest case is what the government did and the state agency, that they made people believe that helping migrants it's illegal. So in Polish case, the situation is about the discourse, and of course some, as you said, those situations that you cannot record, like because they're not officially done. There is no criminal cases or stuff like this. They're like just this symbolic violence towards activists, and also a little bit physical violence, but mostly the symbolic one, and the situation that we are all the time intimidated. So this is the situation in Poland. It's ongoing for like a year and a half, and nothing is changing. So the work that we're doing, it's the big work that was done is to convince people that providing humanitarian aid for migrants, it's legal. So we're just saying this all the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, for sharing that. And now we're going to go, in relation to the geographical context of our group here, we're going to go to a near neighbour working also in the European context, to Imogen Dobby from the Sea-Watch Legal Fund. Welcome, Imogen.
Thanks, Lucy, for having me. So yes, I'm going to give an introduction to criminalisation of humanitarianism and activism in the case of the Mediterranean. And I'll talk a bit about some of the broader trends that this is related to, which Lucy's touched on. And then just give a very brief description of the Sea-Watch Legal Aid Fund, which is the organisation I'm representing, and what we aim to do as an organisation in the face of criminalisation. So the civil activists who are engaged in providing assistance to people on the move in the Mediterranean are facing increasing criminalisation by member states, mainly member states of the European Union, especially for the past 5 years or so. What European states have been doing is seizing and impounding search and rescue ships, which are conducting rescue operations in the central Mediterranean, and prosecuting crew members and activists working on these ships under criminal laws. The beginnings of this really became apparent in the case of the Juventa, which was a search and rescue ship run by a German NGO called Jugendrettet. So in August 2017, the Italian MRCC, which is the Maritime Rescue Control Center, ordered the Juventa to the port of Lampedusa in Italy, where the ship was confiscated by the Italian authorities. And investigations were conducted into the ship's operations. And these investigations were actually eventually expanded beyond this ship, the Juventa, and its crew to include civil activists and humanitarians who were working for Save the Children and MSF. And eventually members of all three of these NGOs were charged for aiding and abetting unauthorized immigration to Europe. And this trial actually began earlier this year, although it's been adjourned twice due to mistakes made by the prosecution. Another case of criminalization, which became very famous in the Mediterranean, was the arrest of Carola Rackete, who was the then captain of the Sea-Watch 3, another search and rescue ship, in June 2019. So Carola was arrested after rescuing 52 people who were found in distress off the coast of Libya. And the ship, the Sea-Watch 3, was looking for a safe port to dock in and to disembark rescued migrants in. But the Italian authorities refused to let the ship enter Italian ports. And as conditions on board worsened, Carola eventually decided to enter Italian waters without permission. And she was arrested and placed under investigation also for aiding and abetting unauthorized immigration. These charges were later dropped and recognized as unfounded because her decision had been based on the need to save human life, but it became a very famous moment of Mediterranean criminalization. But this is an issue much broader than these two cases. So data collected by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights shows that more than 40 criminal investigations have been initiated by European states against organizations and individuals who've conducted rescues at sea since 2017. And these civil activists have been charged with crimes, including the facilitation of irregular migration, as mentioned before, human smuggling, also membership in a criminal organization, and money laundering. And at the same time, it's important to mention that it's not just activists and humanitarian aid workers who are being criminalized. Those on the move themselves at sea are being targeted by this drive on the part of EU member states. And this is an attempt basically to restrict their mobility and restrict their ability to reach Europe. So most obvious in this case are arrests of migrant boat drivers. So those people on the move who are steering or driving the ships, often these are asylum seekers themselves. And they are accused of smuggling and facilitating illegal immigration as well. And they face sentences of up to 30 years in prison. But important to mention that in all of these cases, those being criminalized are activists and humanitarian volunteers who are actually upholding the international law of the sea, which obliges people to rescue those who are in distress at sea, and they're giving their free time to provide this humanitarian assistance, or they are people who themselves are escaping conflict and persecution and who are seeking asylum, which is a fundamental human right. And this drive towards criminalization really has taken off with the much broader shift on the part of the EU towards restrictive and militarized border policing. So initially until around 2013, member states of the EU, they were markedly reluctant to work with vessels in the Mediterranean who were conducting rescues, but they didn't prosecute these vessels or members working on them for conducting rescues. But this really changed with the expansion of the powers of the EU border agency, which is called Frontex, in 2015, and the wider shift which this marked of a turn to militarized policies of surveillance and interception at sea instead of rescue and support and assistance. So it was really as a result of this changing mentality, which also was fueled by the implication of a so-called migration crisis, that EU members began actively prosecuting NGOs that were involved in rescue activities. So in this way, I think it's important to see criminalisation in the Mediterranean as connected to some much broader trends, including rising populism and anti-immigration sentiment, the investment of increasing sums of money in really complex controls and technologies that make it harder to reach Europe and, in essence, construct what's become known as Fortress Europe. And also the pushing of border controls outside of Europe itself, which is called the externalization of border controls. So I'm speaking about these concerns today on behalf of the Sea-Watch Legal Aid Fund, which was founded in 2018 as a response to unjust criminalization. And as Lucy mentioned, it was founded as a response to criminalization in the Mediterranean and at sea, but our concerns are expanding well beyond this remit as criminalization itself expands. So the Legal Aid Fund aims to ensure the protection and the enforcement of the rights of all individuals and groups who find themselves criminalized. We support activists who are working in support of people on the move, the captains of crews of commercial vessels and private ships, and migrants themselves who have been prosecuted under criminal laws. And we support these groups and individuals by covering their legal costs and advocating on their behalf. And as an organization, we believe that it's unjust for anybody to be prosecuted for helping people on the move. And we aim to call out such prosecution for what it reveals, which is the state suppression of civil society mobilization and of mobility. And our goal in advocacy terms is often to situate these legal cases of criminalization in much broader political contexts to show how they form part of much wider and often racialized targeting of irregular migrants and those who assist them. And it's for this reason that the Crimes of Solidarity database is such an exciting development, because it helps to put the criminalization of civil activists in the Mediterranean into a broader context beyond Europe, which is global, and in which states are criminalizing activists all around the world. So it's great to be here today. I'll leave it there, but thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Imogen. And thank you to everyone for keeping to a nice pithy time slot. Okay, we have Gina and possibly also Ro may join speaking about from their position in the US working in No More Deaths. So I'll invite Gina to begin.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for coordinating this. It's really an honor to be on a panel with people doing incredible work. My name is Gina. I'm a volunteer with the organization No More Deaths based in Tucson, Arizona. I do have a toddler home with me, so excuse me if there's some background noise. I also work as an ICU nurse. So in No More Deaths, I originally was an EMT, an emergency medical technician, and now I'm in a hospital setting. When Ro comes back, Ro is also a medical professional. So I want to talk about the work that No More Deaths does. And the peak of our criminalization happened in 2018 to 2020. So I want to talk about two different legal cases that happened then. And then maybe some overarching themes that we've seen on the US-Mexico border that really tie into what Marta and Imogen were saying so far. So the first case that I'll talk about was on a land jurisdiction called Cabeza Prieta. On the US-Mexico border, which is a huge border, there's a government policy called prevention through deterrence. The idea is that Border Patrol focuses their enforcement on city centers. So there's a lot of enforcement around like legal crossing places at in city centers. And then where there's actual wall construction, that happens also around city centers. But the border wall is only within 100, 200, 300 miles around the cities. And then people are funneled outside of those, around those walls, into very remote desert. This prevention to deterrence is intentional to funnel people into very remote areas where they're more likely to die, have very serious medical problems trying to walk dozens of miles through remote desert where there's no water or supplies or cell phone service or ways to call for support. One land jurisdiction in Western Arizona, Cabeza Prieta, which is the National Wildlife Refuge, they actually changed their permitting. So for members of the public to have access to this land, to go hiking on there recreationally, for example, you have to get special permitting to access that land. And they changed in 2017 the language in their permit to target humanitarian aid volunteers. They said that in order to have the permit, you're agreeing to not leaving water bottles, water containers, food items, blankets, clothing, footwear, or medical supplies. Good job, baby. In that area, which is pretty much exactly what No More Death does. We hike migrant trails and leave these supplies for migrants walking to the area to access. So it put us in a position where in order to do our work, we are violating this federal clause, but the clause was changed to target us. We ended up with 9 volunteers who had a variety of misdemeanors. Most of them were littering charges. An interesting theme that we've seen in the US and other movements is the juxtaposition of environmentalism versus migration. So we had littering charges, driving charges, saying that we are driving illegally on protected land. Relatively minor, all of those are only punishable by 2-year sentences in jail. So not nothing, but relatively minor charges, but it was more that they were trying to give lots of people these charges, very much with the intention to make people believe that helping migrants or accessing this land at all is illegal. Witnessing is another big part of this because it's 300 square miles. It's a huge land jurisdiction. Every time we go out there, we would find at least 2 or 3 people who had died in the desert. There were so many human remains, and the crisis of disappearance of so many families who never find their loved ones because their bodies are never found is a lot of the advocacy work that our organization does as well. So the other thing with wanting people not to access this land at all was to cover up just how many people have died and are dying on that land. We actually won those cases. They were thrown out on, the legal defense we used was called RFRA. It's a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which, not to get too nitty gritty, but it was complicated legal defense. The religious freedom argument that we used said that it was in our spiritual, ethical, moral beliefs as volunteers to help migrants. And under this act as a religious freedom, that protected us, and we ended up winning all of those charges. Everyone was acquitted. That's complicated because the far right also uses that Religious Freedom Act for their benefit. So they say things such as, we don't want to hire gay or queer people in our place in this wherever business because it's against my religious or spiritual beliefs. So it's complicated to strengthen this Religious Freedom Act, that it worked for us in this case, but it's more frequently used in far right legal cases. The other case that I want to touch on was the case of Scott Warren, who was an individual volunteer. You mentioned him in your the cases you were discussing earlier. So Scott was a No More Deaths volunteer who was charged with 2 counts of felony harboring and smuggling. No More Deaths has a handful of humanitarian aid stations across the border. Some of them function like shelter spaces where big groups of people come through, access supplies, and move on. Others function more like clinic spaces where people can rest. People in severe dehydration need varying amounts of medical support. So the place where Scott was arrested was where two young men who were migrating were receiving care, medical care and respite. And this was very retaliatory. He was arrested the morning after No More Deaths published a report with a lot of documentation of Border Patrol agents destroying our humanitarian aid supplies. So like dumping out gallons, slashing gallons, just destroying the work that we do. So we had collected a lot of footage of this documentation, released that report. That afternoon, they raided the house where these two migrants were receiving care and arrested Scott Warren and gave him 2 counts of these felony harboring and smuggling charges. That turned into a long legal battle. The 2 men who were arrested, the 2 migrants who were arrested, were held awaiting depositions. And then I see, you can finish it right there. Yeah. They were held waiting for those trials to resolve. So they were imprisoned for 2 years. Eventually, after 2 trials, just give me just a moment. Eventually, we were acquitted on a jury trial. So in the US, on a jury trial, it needs to be a unanimous decision. And the full jury decided that Scott was not guilty of these harboring, smuggling charges, which is a really powerful win. The last thing I just wanted to touch on was the continuing raids that we're facing at all of our humanitarian aid spaces. There's one location particularly that services a lot of migrants in a different corridor than when Scott was arrested. But there was a period from 2020 through really the past 2 years, that border control here they're always increasingly militarized, but the level of militarization became really hostile. They were regularly raiding our camp in full tactical gear and holding migrants and volunteers at gunpoint, detaining different groups of people, questioning. And that is all within their legal scope, which has become increasingly broad as they get more and more power as Border Patrol agents. So there were no arrests in that, but some of the most direct state violence that our organization is seeing is actually from not arrests, but these raids of our humanitarian aid stations. The messaging there seems to be to volunteers to not do this work, and also to migrants, that it's making our shelter spaces have a reputation of not being safe to migrants also, which is very intentional messaging. Yeah. Ro, I think that you're back. Do you want to touch on some of the overarching, some things to link it together, or I'm happy to do that as well if you need a moment.
I know that we're probably close to time, Lucy. Hi, I'm Ro. Thank you all for having us. This is, I had a little situation I had to attend to. Everything's okay now, I think. Yeah, thank you, Gina, for everything that you've said so far. I think you really touched on the main points. I think that some points that I wanted to just highlight are, yes, the retaliatory nature of these legal cases and the ways that it has made people have a lot of fear around engaging in this work, which I understand is like probably kind of one of the main points of this whole talk in a certain way. And then also just a reminder, and I think other folks have spoken to this as well, and I know that this is also included in this narrative of just that the fact that we can even kind of touch on the individual details of these individual cases speaks to, in some ways, the rareness of this comparatively to the hundreds and thousands of like nameless deaths and nameless and those people do not actually not have names, but like we cannot even count or document. There isn't even a database for the numerous people people who are being criminalized just for their very survival. And so I think that although it's like this is such an important topic, I think that it's also important to remember that it's also like a very tiny drop compared to the huge number of people who are being criminalized for their very existence inside of the structures of the US-Mexico border in particular, and borders and migration in the world over. So thank you, Lucy, for bringing this talk together. And I just wanted to bring those pieces in. And I think that we are probably at time. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Ro. Yeah, super important point. And let's go on to Jose now. And then we do have Ethan who can speak next. And I think hopefully Ro will be able to pick up on some of the things that you've said and hear hopefully more from you as well in the discussion aspect.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very valuable opportunity to share all these different horizons for the same cause under different contexts. And what I would like to say from my side is I would like to relate it to two issues. One has been the increasing number of undocumented migrants and asylum seekers in Mexico. Just to mention, in around 2014, UN estimated that about 500,000 people, 500,000 people cross the southern border every year. And the UN estimated that of those, at least half of those require international protection. Now the numbers have gone up dramatically. Just in 2021, it was 130,000 asylum requests in Mexico, being the third country in number of asylum seekers in the world, I believe only after Germany as a second. And but now it's estimated that at least 2 million people cross undocumented every year through Mexico. So that increase of amount has also led to a more complex scenario. In 2005, there was a very relevant case in which a woman from a poor community was incarcerated, accused of smuggling migrants, and she was sentenced to 6 years just for providing food for migrants. And because of all the political and social action that took place after that, she was released after, I believe, 2 years in prison, and that led also to a change in the law in Mexico, in the legal framework, from stating a difference between smuggling and humanitarian assistance. So that formally that led to an important change officially, but regarding defenders of migrants. But at the same time, what took place has been an increasing presence of organized crime through all these migrant scenario. So I will say it will seem to me that two patterns have taken place since then. Regarding the biggest threat for defenders of migrants, now the main threat comes from organized crime. Human rights defenders, journalists, any kind of social movement, the main threat comes from organized crime. After that legal framework formally from the government took place, criminalization remains, but mainly towards migrants and asylum seekers. And In fact, the government has created a new military body that initially was like a national police, but it has more and more been becoming part of a military structure. And most of these troops have been sent to detain migrants in the southern border, the Guardia Nacional. So migrants and asylum seekers, they face two challenges: criminalization of from government authorities, police, the military, immigration officers, but also the terrible threat of organized crime regarding kidnapping, trafficking, extortion, etc. And well, criminalization and also threat from organized crime. I will say that recently, the last situations in which human defenders regarding working with migrants took place was during the caravans in 2020, 2021, when the government accused some of the leaders of these migrant defenders of being involved in smuggling. That was formally the last government position regarding criminalization of migrant defenders. But the main role, the real operating structure threatening defenders of migrants is organized crime. More and more territorial control and the presence of organized crime together in government structures, in different activities, it's dramatically worsening week by week. So I will say that unfortunately, the biggest threat to migrant defenders nowadays in Mexico comes from organized crime, apparently acting together with government structures. That's what I will like to highlight from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just before we go to Ethan, I wanted to draw attention, because we're coming towards the discussion soon. If you're an audience member and you had any questions that you would like posed to members of the panel, if you go to the page that you joined on, and then there's a kind of blue box that says join the discussion, and if you click on the launch button, it just says launch in blue, then you'll go to this page, this Slido, it's called Slido page, but you can just type a question there if you would like to pose anything or to share any of your own experiences, maybe from places that you're working in. Okay, I'll now introduce Ethan from the Transnational Justice Working Group. Welcome, Ethan, and I know that it is the middle of the night there, so it kind of that's how grateful we are.
No worries, I'm a night type person, so thank you, Lucy, for organizing this important and timely forum with activists from around the world, and also for inviting me. I think a little background information would be in order when it comes to discussion of North Korean escapees. As many of you probably know, North Korea is one of the few last remaining totalitarian isolationist states, and is still under this kind of very strict dictatorial rule. But since the mid-1990s, when North Korea was struck by a great famine, there has been a steady flow of migrants or refugees flowing out from North Korea, primarily to China. You might wonder why North Koreans would not cross over the border to South Korea, but it just so happens to be that the two Koreas share a land border that is probably the most heavily militarized since the end of the armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953. So this means that there is effectively no way for most North Koreans to travel directly to defect directly to South Korea, although there have been up to about 100 North Koreans that have made such an escape on the sea over the past 30 years. So the vast majority of the North Koreans have to make this flight to China, and unfortunately, the Chinese authorities are not hospitable, to put it mildly, towards the North Korean migrants. Now, it's worth noting that China is actually a state party to the UN Convention on the Status of the Refugees, and also the UN Convention Against Torture. Now, the official position of the Chinese government is that it deals with the North Korean migrants or refugees according to domestic law, international law, and humanitarian principles. That has been their official position since the 1990s. But in practice, the Chinese policy with respect to the North Koreans is not really in accordance with international law or humanitarian principles as we know it. In fact, their national law and also there are treaties that with North Korea which allow the deportation of North Korean escapees is directly in contradiction with the international law. First of all, China does not recognize any of the migrants as refugees under the UN Refugee Convention. They consider these North Korean escapees as economic migrants or illegal aliens entering China on economic grounds rather than on political grounds. Okay, even if one agrees with this Chinese assumption, it's as like I said, China is also party to the Refugee Convention, which actually prohibits the return or deportation of people to a jurisdiction where the people, those individuals, face the likelihood of torture. And it's very safe to assume that the people returned from China to North Korea face torture, executions, and other human rights violations. But none of that really matters to China because the greatest concern for the Chinese government is that once they allow this flow of North Koreans into China, that this would lead to the collapse of the North Korean government. So because of this very difficult legal situation, there have been both a lot of South Korean missionaries missionaries, business people, and also the family members of the North Koreans who have already escaped to South Korea have tried to assist the North Korean migrants in China. But over the years, the Chinese government has imposed very strict draconian laws against these individuals. And it's very ironic that they use the charge of human trafficking against many of these people who try to help the North Korean migrants in a very cynical manner. And what this has resulted is that most of the humanitarians, the people with good intentions that try to help the North Korean escapees, have been driven out or deported from China. And this actually means that the remaining people who can help the North Korean escapees or migrants are, in fact, more likely to be human traffickers. So this distinction between humanitarian people who want to provide humanitarian assistance and people who are in it for money, basically as human traffickers, has become very blurry. And so this is a very sad case where this kind of draconian application of law by the Chinese authorities have resulted in this proliferation of human trafficking that their law is actually supposed to limit. And just to give the most recent development, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, North Korea was actually one of the first countries in the world to impose the border lockdown in January 2020. So now things have become even more difficult for the migrants, people to escape from North Korea. And not only on the North Korean side, but also on the Chinese side. The Chinese government, as you know, have imposed very strict limitations on movements of not only North Koreans, but of all other people living within the Chinese borders. So all this has made life more difficult for the North Korean migrants in China. And it has also made it more difficult for NGOs or other humanitarians to help out the North Korean migrants. Now, I think I see a very global pattern here, but again, this is, I would like to highlight this kind of plight of the North Korean refugees and people who want to help them in China. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And collectively, thank you so much for sticking to time so that we've just finished around the hour, which is ideal to have a discussion. So I just wanted to kick off the discussion by inviting you to share any thoughts, if anyone wanted to share any thoughts of things that have struck you while listening to other people working in other places, kind of similarities, or things that you think are really unique about your way you're working, but particularly thinking across the cases, connections and trends in different places. And how do you think maybe we can understand and make sense of some of these trends across these really different places? Feel free to just start talking, or you can raise your hand. It's up to you. Maybe I'll go back to Marta because she started us at the beginning and
I can see Jose raising his hand.
I'm sorry, it didn't appear on my screen. Jose, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Just to mention, yesterday, for example, we had a meeting with UNHCR office in Mexico, together with some organizations, regarding horizons for the next year, and just to mention how it has expanded the emptiness from the state regarding protection of migrants and asylum seekers' rights and human rights defenders, how the state has been vanishing from its role regarding protection, and more unfortunately acting as a political tool of organized crime. So in an area of Mexico, just some offices will be closing due to the pressure of organized crime. So just to highlight how the situation is worsening, so that human rights organizations and migrant organizations have been forced to withdraw under the presence of organized crime and under the complicity of the state. Thank you. That's what I just wanted to add.
Yes, Imogen.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's been super interesting to hear all these different perspectives. And I think going back to your question, Lucy, about connections, I think what really struck me, two things that have really struck me are, firstly, it's not so much as a unified connection, but how the scale of some of these laws can vary from super, like what we would see as major criminal crimes, including like facilitation of illegal migration, to some much smaller cases. I mean, Jeannie, you were mentioning like being charged with littering or stuff that we would maybe not see in connection to actually the suppression of assistance towards migration. I think in the Mediterranean, we've also seen cases recently where rescue ships pounded under health and safety laws. And people would say, oh, you don't have enough life jackets on board, or you don't have enough freezer space on board, all these very small things. So I think one thing that struck me across these cases is the difference in scale and the variety of some of the laws and legal instruments and accusations which are being leveled at activists and people on the move. And then secondly, the idea that this that criminalization is also super connected to discourse as well. I mean, Marta was mentioning this in Poland, and Ethan was also mentioning how asylum seekers are termed, are described as economic migrants or as illegal aliens. And I think how this feeds into actual cases of criminalization is very interesting, because the discourse does create a certain permissibility or enable sometimes certain laws to be used, whereas if that discourse were not present, there may be more resistance towards criminalization. Yeah, those are the things that stuck out to me.
Yeah, thanks, Imogen. I think it is really striking the way that a discourse of criminality is used as a tool, to even a kind of preventative tool, even where there's very little chance of actually formal criminalization. Although I wonder if in the Mexican context that's different. Maybe it's a discourse of danger from organized crime or threat, but maybe you can reflect on that. I can see Marta and then Ro have your hands up, so let's go to Marta and then Ro.
Yeah, the things that strike me most is that regular people are taking responsibilities of the states, mainly in rescuing others' life. And this is, it was especially visible in this case of Poland, when people who were never ever before thought about, farmers, like someone who worked at shop, or regular people who didn't want to be an activist, were forced by the state to be an activist, and still they are there, have their regular normal jobs, and then in the evening they just have a pin, because we're just getting the pin where to go or to provide an assistance for the migrants, and then they're just leaving their children and going to the forest for a few hours, couple of hours, maybe a day, to just help to assist the migrants, depends on their situation. So what strikes me most is that the citizens, or regular people, not even the citizens, taking the responsibility of the state to protect human lives. And the states, all of our states, are somehow obliged by different international laws to protect human lives, and the states are not doing this, the regular inhabitants are doing. And the other thing is related to this, that we have to somehow rebel and act against the state that we're living in. And there is this division between what part of the people wants, and they want no border, or no pushbacks at least, and then what the state is or the states are doing. So those two things came to my mind, and I can see that no matter the location, those things are functioning.
Yeah, Ro, and then Gina also has a hand up.
Yeah, Marta, I feel like it was very similar what I was thinking, and I really appreciate what you said. But I think that it strikes me that in all of these different contexts, there are laws that are supposed to protect the people doing these things, and whether it's in a place where there are explicit laws in Poland, or there are places, I don't know, in all of these different contexts, there are both conflicting laws and laws that are meant to protect people. And yet, regardless of those laws, the like desire of the state to keep migrants out and the function of borders to criminalize and separate people in all of the different ways are still functioning to deter people both from crossing, and not people are actually being deterred, but are intended to deter people from crossing, and also intended to deter people from helping, regardless of the amount of legal protection that is theoretically in place. So I think it's just interesting, and what I would like to imagine is, what does that say about how to be the most strategic? Because in all of these contexts, there are like differences in the legality of what people are doing based on the laws in place. And yet there's like one kind of clear ethical direction around helping people to not die, not suffer, and to have like very basic self-determination around their lives. And it's just interesting how in different contexts people are being criminalized kind of regardless of what official laws are in place around the movement of people and the protection of people, helping people. Anyways, I hope that wasn't too obtuse, but I was just thinking that it kind of like speaks to hopefully what we can imagine our next steps being like all across the world, because I guess I would argue that that means that like changing the laws is kind of irrelevant because in these places where there are even laws that are protecting people, like in Poland, they can still do whatever they want to try to convince people that it's illegal, and to do all of these kind of not microaggressions, but basically torment people who are doing this work to make them feel like, regardless of the laws that are protecting them, they are not able to actually do it. And then obviously in the case of the US-Mexico border, where they're like, one of the things that we used in the Scott Warren case was information about like humanitarian aid is never a crime. That was what we like, those were the posters that we put up. That was what was put up everywhere. But obviously that's like the goal, but it's not the reality. Like they'll use anything to criminalize the things that we're doing, even if it's not illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go into Gina, because I bet she is going to pick up on that as well.
Yeah, well, overarchingly, I was really struck by a lot of the similarity around this messaging. And I think, yeah, Martin, not to quote you too much, but I heard you say that early on as well, that the government is trying to make people believe that humanitarian aid is illegal. And like Cece, they're like Rose said, regardless of what the laws are in place, that messaging is so powerful. I think about the role of NGOs in some of this. I think, Jose, you talked about, you just had met with, I believe you said UN, but I'm thinking about like the big NGOs like Amnesty International, Red Cross, the UN, and where their role is in this. I feel very frustrated that these big non-governmental organizations and international organizations are not taking more powerful stances defending that humanitarian aid is not a crime, because we as a smaller organization and a group of volunteers, we don't have a lot of the public imaging that the Red Cross already does. So when we say humanitarian aid is not a crime, we have to be so armed with legal phrases and explanations and a legal team and a lot to try and empower people to do this work that shows up in their backyard. However, like the Red Cross or these big organizations already have so much respect from the public that, yeah, I'm just thinking about how all of our work could differ if we had more of those powerful agents at our side on our team, or perhaps some of you do, and I'm wondering what those experiences are like.
Ethan.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm also very much struck by how some of the common themes found in these various different situations from different parts of the world. In the whole like discourse of criminality, I think that's again like the use of the safety regulations for the people who try to assist boat people in the Mediterranean. I mean, most people would agree that's pretty cynical, but again, like that's something that I often find in cases often find where in China the authorities use like I said, the trafficking law against the humanitarian assistance. And at the same time, this whole idea of people trying to help the migrants in spite of the existing law is also, I think, I often find in the Chinese context, the North Korean SKP's context as well. And I didn't mention this, but I do come across North Korean migrants who told me that in many cases they come across sympathetic Chinese farmers, Chinese business people, and not only that, but even Chinese officials too, working for the government too. Some of them realize that the rules or the laws that they are trying to apply are not really morally defensible, and they would often turn a blind eye to many of the when they could have apprehended or deported the North Korean migrants. And so yeah, I think trying to come up with the right message to kind of encourage these active or passive people who want to help the migrants. I think that's could be a very effective tactic going forward. Just my observation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Jose has a comment. Oh, you're muted.
I still need one more year to get used to that button.
Classic.
I'm sorry. It calls my attention. I am not an expert, but following the news last year, it seemed to me it's not the word interesting, but to read how the Polish government was accusing the Belarusian government of using hybrid migrants as a pressure as a result of all the accusations regarding human rights violations in Belarus. Then I read something similar, some statements similar from the British government towards the French government, that they were letting migrants crossing through the channel as a retaliation, as a revenge after Brexit. Then something similar was used in Mexico with the U.S. and Mexican administration as an economical pressure, and also within Mexico, that migrants were used as a way to destabilize the new government. So that common language calls my attention as a criminalization from high political levels worldwide. And regarding what Gina was mentioning, we were particularly talking about that yesterday, that with this emptiness or complicity from state authorities connected with organized crime, even if we know that we cannot give up on advocacy with state structure, we have to strengthen our connections with private and social sectors as a way to gain some kind of allies within our local societies. We need to strengthen our positions in terms of protection regarding organized crime. If we have locally a more strengthened tissue connections with local communities, but at the same time, and I think that's why this space that you're providing is so valuable, because at the same time we need international connection, as Gina was mentioning, with the weak presence of big human rights organizations to somehow this kind of reactions worldwide in case of a threat from organized crime or from authorities can represent at least more chances of protection. So I think this space that you're providing, I think it's so valuable because it opens that horizon in a more complex, and the horizons, all the trends just point to that it's going to get worse, because we will have, well, now we have in the US the midterms elections, and the migration issue is at the center of the argument. Then we will have the next US presidential elections, the same in our case in Mexico. The struggle, just the electoral fight for all this, and the migrants just represent a way to strengthen all their capacities economically, with all the resources that it provides, and all the political gain that provides a criminalization statement towards society. So thanks for this space, and I hope that it can provide new horizons of collaboration, of international collaboration, and somehow protection. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is interesting about that. Like, there is not one single case in the database of somebody working at a large international humanitarian organization being arrested or having being criminalized for the work that they're doing. And I think somebody has commented in the Q&A about them lacking financial independence from states. And I think in order to act in particular spaces, those large organizations then I don't know, agree to a set of ground rules, or become complicit essentially in some of those systems, as we know from the work around border humanitarianism. But I think what then happens is essentially those organizations, in order to kind of be pragmatic and continue to operate pragmatically, then basically abandon this situation, which is escalating. Marta, I think you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, I want to refer to two things. So one, what the Jose said, that we were only in Poland managed to provide for almost a year humanitarian aid due to the local communities. So if not the locals, there would be many more deaths that they have already been. So working with local community was crucial for our actions. Without them, we wouldn't make it, and migrants wouldn't make it. And the other things that I want to, like the example from Poland, I want to show how strong the discourse is in building this criminalization, is that probably all of you are, and our viewers are aware of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And we have first on the northeast of Poland border with Belarus, and then with Ukraine. So just imagine that for doing exactly the same thing, so providing a bottle of water, providing a blanket, holding a child and keeping it warm, on Polish-Ukrainian borders, you were clapped, you were called a hero, you could drove people, they were like just passing the borders, still they were not having any documents or stuff like this in the very first day, because there was no law at the time existing. So basically you could be called like trafficker because you are driving them to the main cities or so on. And for those people who are doing this, they were called heroes. And if you would do exactly the same thing a few kilometers north on the border with Belarus, you would be for sure like called traitor, but you could be at least arrested and have case in court, maybe not prosecuted, but you could be intimidated, you could spend some time in like being arrested or stuff like this. So as you can see in Polish case, the laws are exactly same, or were exactly same on both borders, and only the discourse was totally different. So I want to show how the discourse, what is the power of discourse.
Yeah, and I think that's a pattern we've seen. I had a meeting with somebody in Japan the other day who was telling me about the different visa welcome scheme for Ukrainian refugees versus other groups of refugees, even in Japan, so remote from that war zone. So I wanted to ask a question to everybody around the kind of ultimate different treatment of people of different statuses. So in the database, I'm interested in all cases where people are arrested and criminalized for having some kind of assistance, solidarity, help. And that includes people who are migrants themselves, people of all kind of statuses. But then, as I think Ro indicated after Gina had discussed the Scott Warren case, it is so much easier to get the very fine details and the legal documentation for example, citizens, and then various media sources to corroborate and verify, and many different accounts and perspectives. And even though we know that cases of, for example, I'm thinking in the Channel and the Mediterranean, we know there is huge number of cases where people are arrested for being involved in helping each other, especially taking over, driving a ship in a difficult circumstance, just touching the tiller of the ship to steer it out of danger. Then there are many of those people who are criminalized, but the outcome is not a legal process through the courts that we then have a kind of trail to follow, and there might be lots of press that can be brought. It's detention and deportation very quickly, and some of those cases you do find the documentation and I can record, but I just wanted to sort of reflect on that kind of process of accounting for the different kind of inequalities and hierarchies within the people who find themselves criminalized in the different contexts you're working in. If anyone had anything they wanted to reflect where they are. And in fact, actually, in the case of China, I noticed in many cases, if the person is Chinese, the punishment is to be imprisoned. If they are South Korean or Japanese, they're sent back to their country of origin. If they're North Korean, they're sent to North Korea. So very different kind of punishments for those. Imogen.
Yeah, I think this is a super important issue because, and it's actually, I mean, I mentioned earlier that the Sea-Watch Legal Aid Fund was founded mainly to support civil activists and humanitarians that were criminalized in the Mediterranean, but it's expanding its work increasingly more towards assisting migrants and people on the move themselves, partly for this reason, because they have no platform of support in these cases when they're criminalized, and it's so much more difficult to make your voice and your legal defense heard. For example, I mentioned a case of Carola Rackete and her arrest in 2019 was actually very counterintuitive from the EU, because it generated a lot of support for search and rescue at sea.
I think you might need to give some information on the case in case people are...
Yeah, of course. So Carola Rackete was working for Sea-Watch, which is a search and rescue NGO, and she was arrested after bringing these migrants ashore. But there was such a big, it made such a big splash in the media that actually it just generated a lot of pro-migration support and a lot of discourse around this idea that saving lives should not be a crime. Which actually in terms of discourse really helped to challenge the criminalization of assistance at sea. But in the case of, in the case of those on the move who are criminalized as migrant boat drivers, they don't have the access that European activists have to the press, and to channels of communication where you can make this kind of defense. And so I think it's important to recognize these equalities and also yeah, this is partly why we aim to become more of an advocacy platform for those people, as well as aid workers and humanitarians.
If I may, I just wanted to add, I think the what Lucy mentioned about the Chinese government's treatment of different humanitarians based on their nationality. I think in that sense that this kind of nationality or law, the legal regime matters in a very different way, and like you said, if those humanitarians happen to be North Korean nationals, as part of obviously the worst case, they'd be sent back to North Korea, and God knows what awaits them. And in the Chinese case, if they have to be Chinese nationals, then the Chinese government will probably punish them as human traffickers. Whereas if the people, the humanitarians, happen to be South Koreans or other nationals, they are probably likely to be detained and sentenced, but released because of the international incidents that such trials will cause. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that this kind of how should I say, the nationality of the humanitarians, it's not always I guess the most absolute factor, in the sense that there are examples where depending on if a certain incident raises international concern, or some NGOs, some big name NGOs decide to intervene, or the UN decides to intervene, that does have this kind of a mitigating factor when it comes to the Chinese government's treatment of such humanitarians. So I guess again, this goes back to the point that having the right narrative, or the right, I guess, way to publicize these events can help humanitarians, supporters in many cases. And there's no like easy solution or easy simplified way of doing this, but I think we try to be creative and trying to help out the humanitarians in whatever ways we can, in a very pragmatic manner. But I'm sure other people are in their own different areas are doing the same. So I'd be interested if other people have similar stories to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Ro wants to come in.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me, and that I have to step off the call. I really appreciated hearing from each of you. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And we do have some resources that we can share, and maybe Lucy, we can share them with you afterwards, and you can send them around. Mostly just more information about the abuse documentation reports that No More Deaths made, and then a few other things that people can check out, including a Democracy Now! Interview around the Scott Warren trial. So I'd be happy to share those out just so that people can understand a little bit more about the US-Mexico border context from the northern side perspective. And thank you all for being here and for what you're doing. And thank you, Lucy, for putting on this call.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming, Ro. And I'm sure everyone will be really interested to see those resources and might also have resources to share. I'm conscious also that Ethan probably wants to go to bed, needs to leave because it's very late there. So shall we, I suggest that we bring the meeting to a close. People have to go to work, people have to go to bed and everything in between. But I just wanted to thank you all for just taking the time to meet and have, I think conversations are so powerful, and to share conversations across borders. And I know most of the people on the call are speaking in a second language, and and yeah, in difficult times. So thank you so much for making that space to have those conversations. And I've learned a lot from this meeting, and I hope that you'll be able to connect with each other as well, and that the audience, of course, enjoyed listening and learning about this important issue. Okay, so I'll say bye-bye and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you, and a good evening. Good
Thank
night.
you, everyone else, too.